From hands-on to zero touch. I'm pausing here for a brief moment for you to review the forward-looking statement. It will also be available for a detailed review if you'd like under resources. So my name is Adam. I work at Hamilton College, and my position is a desktop system administrator. What I end up doing is what some places call client platform engineering, but also a little bit of the standard run and grab and IT support type stuff. I've presented over at the Penn State Mac Admins Conference a few times, but this is my first time doing a pre-recorded one. So from hands-on to zero touch, I had some goals for zero touch. I wanted to use Prestage Enrollment. I wanted to use DEP Notify. I wanted to use Nomad, and I wanted to be able to ship a computer to someone so that a user can log in and prepare the machine. This workflow that we've got now has been in flux for the last few years. We started with Gold Master imaging using Deploy Studio. And about 3 years ago, we moved over to Jamf imaging using a package-based enrollment, but it was still net booting and connecting and erasing and installing. Last year, we started using Apple's automated device enrollment, or DEP, and now we're doing a zero touch. So we had Jamf set up for a while, but when I was first brought onto the team, it was mostly self-service for printers and ensuring compliance with our antivirus software. And we switched to Jamf imaging for that package-based workflow. And we were still using the netboot, erasing that whole workflow that takes a lot of time, but it also requires the erase install by pushing a flat image over to it, as opposed to what a lot of the new systems that have things like T2s require you to actually install a firmware update. So because we've done this workflow in a way that we started doing package management and we started doing individual pieces of software installed as opposed to just that Gold Master image, it was easier to take this and start pushing toward these newer workflows. So we were able to modify and change as we needed to go to that Jamf imaging, to then go to a DEP workflow, and then be able to migrate to a zero touch workflow as everyone went remote. So one of the big questions that we always have is, what is imaging? What are the goals of imaging? Is to prepare a machine. We want to install the required software and ensure that the devices are managed and talk back to our systems. It makes things standardized, and it gives the same basic software and management everywhere. And why can't we image the old way? There's a lot of reasons. With newer machines, we've got things like the firmware updates that I mentioned earlier. We've got T2 chips that do not support netboot on those machines, and they only support external boot after you've already gone through the setup assistant and created a local account, then rebooted to go to recovery, and then turned on external boot. You also can't image in target disk mode. Firmware updates have done more than they used to when it comes to things with the T1 and T2 chips. The touch bar and model specific items are no longer included in the installer. They reach out to the internet to grab them. There's security changes for things like the UAMDM, the User Approved Mobile Device Management, and UAKEL, the User Approved Kernel Extension Loading. And there's future controls that will probably only be available to machines enrolled via automated device enrollment. And if everyone is remote, there's a lot of additional complications if we have to touch every machine before the user gets it. Now, there is an asterisk to why you can't image. You can if you really want to. It is possible to restore an image to a T2 machine, and even the new iMacs, which are not T2 enabled but do not support netboot, although there are also now the 27-inch iMacs that are T2 enabled. You can go through and make a disk image the way that you used to, but it has to be model specific, and it can only work if the machine has already been updated to the right version of the OS. This means that you can only do that for each batch of machines that come in with that specific version of the OS. It's multiple workflows for everything that comes in. Every piece of hardware could be different. And every time that the OS changes, we're even talking about minor, dot updates, not major releases. Every time that it changes, you're going to have to do something different. So why would we waste time doing this when we can ship the machine to a new user and get them going right away? Just a quick story about imaging as to why I've gone through and changed things from some of those previous ways that we were working. And this was a couple of years ago. We were setting up Jamf imaging to lay down the blank OS. And this was back in the High Sierra days of 10.13.6. We had it lay down that blank image. We had to install our packages and then do a quick add package to Jamf Pro. A bunch of machines were being re-imaged, and those machines for new users would not accept the image. They were failing to load. And the reason that this turned out is we weren't running the firmware update, because the firmware update is included in the installer. So most of these machines had been running on 10.11 or 10.12, and they weren't supporting APFS drives. So they can boot from an APFS drive once they install that firmware update. But we didn't find this out until we had tried to do a whole group of them. Now, this is something that we had been working on one workflow and considering changing to different workflows. But because of that frustration, I wanted to make sure that we were not in that situation again. And I looked at doing a DEP workflow that would automatically install what we needed over the existing OS that Apple ships. There was an article about how you could maybe get around this with a firmware update, that you could pull out the firmware updater and you could run it manually, but it was difficult and it was inconsistent. And even the people who wrote about this sort of told us that it was probably not the best idea. I ended up using the startos install command in the installer and creating a button in self-service to upgrade the machine. And then with 10.13.4 and newer, I was able to use the erase install command. So on some of these, I did have to install and then delete. So everyone talks about ADE and MDM. ADE was formerly known as DEP, which is Automated Device Enrollment and Device Enrollment Program. And the MDM, of course, is Mobile Device Management. In this case, we're going to be using Jamf Pro, but the same information applies whether we call it one thing or the other. So Apple's Device Enrollment automatically assigns machines to your MDM during Setup Assistant, assuming you're connected to the internet. Your MDM takes over and installs the required profiles for your IT and other installs, like the Jamf binary. Automated enrollment allows you to automatically approve things like the user-approved mobile device management and user-approved kernel extension loading, so that things like your antivirus software or Google Drive won't prompt for authorization, and so that you have access to all of the requirements that mobile device management offers. You have some things that now on 10.15 and newer call supervised, but everything before that is whether it was under user approved. So without it, you're running into some issues where there's extra clicks for the user to approve those softwares, like your antivirus or things like Google Drive in some cases. And if your help desk doesn't remember how to walk the user through that, it could run into some issues. It also allows you to configure those machines regardless of location and without needing to physically touch them, which is what we're talking about here when it goes through to zero touch. So when suddenly everyone is remote, we had to ask ourselves, what do we need? We were already a Jamf Cloud customer, but we hadn't yet migrated to the cloud distribution service. One of the first things I did when everyone went remote was clone our data to a cloud repository and make sure that was our primary repository for everyone. I also kept our on-campus one and created a network segment so that it could direct on-campus machines to the local repository that is on campus. I added multiple programs to self-service that users might need, like remote desktop or camera software, Panopto and Zoom and other suddenly popular software that we hadn't really been using before. And I made sure to have a backup secondary option for when something goes wrong. Occasionally, the workflow doesn't trigger when you first set up a machine. And I wanted to make sure that any user that sits down and tries to do this at home has a very easy way to fix it. So now we know the bigger picture of things we want to accomplish. And for the record, this picture is from when I was setting up a bunch of machines last year for a lab. But the idea was that each one I logged in and it just downloaded every piece of software that I needed, and I had it set to log out at the end so I could just deliver those machines over to the lab when I was all set. When you're setting up an enrollment workflow, it's important to go through some of these steps because you may not have been prepared yet. I know that when I was setting this up to go to an automated device enrollment workflow, I had to go through and make sure that my policies and profiles and packages and groups in Jamf all made sense. Make sure that everything was assigned to the right users, departments, and buildings. I had to sign up for Apple School Manager, or you may have to sign up for Apple Business Manager. I was lucky that all of our orders have come through Apple. So I was able to get our customer number from Apple and assign it in to Apple School Manager. And I was able to then connect Jamf Pro to Apple School Manager, and all of our previous orders were assigned. I also set to auto-assign all new machines to Jamf Pro. I manually added all of our existing inventory to Jamf Pro, and then I have it set so that new inventory is added automatically. And it sounds simple, I suppose. The first step might be the most time-consuming because it is ongoing, and especially if you've used Jamf for a long time, you may have a lot of policies or a lot of packages that are either unused or outdated. Since we've bought all our products from Apple directly, it simplified this process. I do know that there are going to be some complications if you've bought from multiple vendors, which may mean that you have to assign multiple vendors in, and not every vendor is able to backdate every purchase that you've made and add it into DEP. This part was easier than I expected. When I got the confirmation in just a few days, I filled out this form. I called up my boss. They ended up calling from Apple to confirm that he, in fact, was my boss and that I was authorized to set this up. And then I got our customer number from Apple and added it. And this ended up being a very simple connection. I auto-assigned new devices and went through our inventory and manually added the old ones. And I made sure to release all the devices that we had since sold or disposed of in one way or another. The first step in this DEP workflow was to use Prestage Enrollment. Profiles can be added to the Prestage, like the UAKEL whitelisting for your antivirus or your wireless profile, and those must stay scoped after enrollment so that they stay installed. You can install your tools of choice, such as DEP Notify, so it can start installing at login. And these things are all installed at the Setup Assistant when you're using a Prestage package and enrollment packages. So I created a new workflow for Prestage Enrollment. I added those profiles and the enrollment packages, and I set it up to skip the parts of Setup Assistant that aren't necessary, things that we may be blocking or controlling because of security concerns, or things that just may take extra time for the user. When deploying the machines, I started using inventory preload to set up the user, location, and department for every machine. I scoped smart groups to assign software and profiles, and I found replacements for modifying the default user template, including tools like Outset, which runs at different times, such as when you log in or boot, and it can run as the user or it can run as root. The nice thing about that means that I can run individual things to change per user instead of having to modify everything. But it also means that any modifications like adding something to the dock can be done per user after the fact as well. So I also was using Desktopper, which is an application to reset the desktop background to a default. And that one requires a little bit less configuration and fewer approvals than if you were using a different way to do it that I had been doing previously using an OSA script. And DocuTil is the tool that I've used, although there are alternates like doclib, which is a Python program that lets you modify the doc either by adding, removing, or completely rewriting the doc for the user. And I have this done only once at login. But a lot of this is updating packages, cleaning up policies, and making sure that we just update each piece as we need it. So when new software comes out, you can use something to automate the current software that you need. You can use something like auto package, and then you can have it auto update and auto upload as needed. Going through every workflow and making policies to install those softwares and new tools makes these things run easier and faster, and we don't have to worry about it every time something new comes out. We're just modifying that one piece. This workflow of perhaps piecemealing each segment that needs to be changed allows us to keep everything up to date individually instead of having to update one large image. So first, with inventory preload that I mentioned earlier, you have to create things like buildings and departments, and you can use an API script to upload them all, or you can use a tool like the MUT, which is a nice front end for the API. Inventory preload gives you an error if you try to upload something to a building or the department that doesn't exist. So it's good to make sure that you've uploaded all of them, either created them manually or used the API to create them. I personally am a big fan of this because I enjoy organizing metadata for my iTunes library to make sure that everything looks just the right way and has all the right information so I can watch just the right kind of comedy when I want to. This screenshot is of the inventory preload template, and there are a lot of different categories or a lot of different pieces of information that you can add to it. I tend to cut down to only the ones that I need, and I modify those CSVs that I export from my inventory management to this format, and then I can upload it to Jamf. What's nice is that I can do this one at a time with an export. I can do it with a script that creates the file. I can do it with any number of ways to then upload to the inventory preload. So once we have a lot of these back-end pieces prepared, we're looking at the automation and the kickoff of our setup. The important tools that I'm using here are DEP Notify, which makes everything look nice on that first login. All it really does is read what's happening and output to the screen and let you know which piece of software is being installed. And then I'm using DEP Notify Starter, which is a script that is available on the Jamf GitHub. And I have it modified to my own uses. But this one calls a series of policies, and it lets you display a message per policy that goes through, and each piece, it can just tell you the progress step. I have API scripts to automate things like setting the computer name to our barcode, setting a firmware password, setting the local admin to the computer owner. And I have scripts like those up on my GitHub, which there will be a link to at the end. I've also created a bunch of smart groups based on departments or buildings or groups that might all need access to the same pieces of software. So this is a piece of the script for the DEP Notify Starter.sh. And this is an array that displays the text in DEP Notify and the custom Jamf trigger for each install. I have them scoped for certain locations, so I have one starter script, and then it'll skip if that policy is not scoped to your machine. It would be just as easy to create separate ones for different types of machines or departments. I just haven't ended up doing that yet. It will end up looking pretty nice and working pretty seamlessly. So the tools that I've used all together for different purposes in this process include the DEP Notify program, which again is just a nice view of the screen while it's installing, and it gives you progress of what's happening. I found it to be the easiest version of that type of software to use that was open source. The DEP Notify Starter.sh script, which I found was offering a whole bunch of great options, and it allowed me to do some nice things like for labs, I have it automatically log out when it's completed, which means I can walk to a machine, run the erase install, and then it can do all of its work once it's logged in. I'm using Nomad, which again is an open source tool to sync a Active Directory account to the user's local account. The reason that we chose this is when we're looking at a machine that is going to be off campus, we can't bind to AD. And there's a lot of discussion about how binding to AD may not be the best option and creating mobile accounts. So we do need that in some cases for things like authentication to certain servers or for things like your wireless profile. But we don't need it for everything. So what we could do is create the local account for the user. And once they're on a VPN connection or on campus, the Nomad program will check, verify that they are logged in, and then verify that their password is in sync. I mentioned Outset, DocuTill, and Desktopper earlier, and those programs are great for setting initial settings for users, and each time they can be modified without having to modify every single piece of a certain file when you're looking at something like a Gold Master image or when you were modifying the entire user template. I also find that using white box packages is a great tool for some of the nitty-gritty packaging when you're changing software or modifying and adding pieces to a piece of software, such as your license file. You can also, of course, use Jamf's version of that with Composer. I've just gotten used to this tool from before I was a Jamf customer, so that's what I continue to use. I also use the open source software Profile Creator because it lets me granularly assign things for a number of different programs when I'm creating profiles to distribute with my MDM. All of these tools together have made things much easier and allowed me to make a workflow that I think moved us from a Gold Master image to a fully automated and zero-touch enrollment without having to give up any real functionality. So I talked a lot about how we were working before, and I talked about the process to change things, but suddenly we were zero touch. Most of this was already configured to fairly easily swap this over for my institution. We primarily needed to migrate to cloud storage. We needed to use Nomad to sync the AD accounts for machines that are not bound. And I needed to make sure I had that kickoff button in self-service in case things went wrong. Because it was mostly configured before we went remote, there were only a few steps. The local account can VPN in and make sure that their password matches AD. And then Nomad is pretty easy to set up. It was a short profile to create. The self-service button to kick off the workflow in case the enrollment trigger fails, which seems to happen on Wi-Fi sometimes. The best that I could figure out is that perhaps it loses its Wi-Fi connection at some point in the setup assistant, and then it reconnects just fine, but it loses the enrollment complete trigger complete. When everything is all said and done, this is how it ends up looking, and it actually pops up and goes along and calls all of our standard software. It is configured to log out, and assuming that the person preparing the machine was in IT, that's very easy. But it was just as easy to let the user know that it was done and just have them be able to click done. And of course, if there's any questions, I'm available for a number of different connections. You can talk to me on the Mac Admin Slack, where my handle is awickert. I'm at @amargyle on Twitter, although I rarely use it. My email address is awickert@hamilton.edu. My blog, where I've posted some of the tools, tips, and tricks that I've found, is adamargyle.wordpress.com. And my GitHub is github.com/adamargyle. And all the scripts that I mentioned in here and a lot of additional tools that I use during our imaging process are posted on there with some explanation on how to use them. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time.